Hello, everyone. My name is Fahad. I'm with Elizabeth, and today we will talk about Truth Commission's case study, Liberia. So, historical overview. In 1980, Master Sergeant Samuel Doe carried out a military coup in which President Tolbert and his aide were publicly executed. Doe suspended the Constitutional and People Redemption Council assumed power. In 1984, the US and other powers pressured Doe to allow political parties to return. In 1985, Doe wins the presidential elections. In 1989, Charles Taylor, leading the National Patriotic Front of Liberia, started an uprising against Doe's government. A civil war began, and in 1991, the Economic Community of West American States intervened to stop the violence. From 1990 to 1969, 14 peace accords were negotiated, but Liberia remained unstable. In 1997, Tyler won the presidential elections. In 1999, conflict arose again, with several rebel groups, including the Liberian United for Reconciliation and Democracy, besieged Monrovia. In 2003, the government and the main rebel group signed a peace agreement and established a transitional government. Result of the 14-year civil war. Pre-war population was 2 million. After the civil war, more than 250,000 died and 1 million displaced, and widespread rape and sexual violence, and recruitment of children as soldiers, militia and traitors. 60 and 70% of the population suffered some form of sexual violence during the conflict. Truth and Reconciliation Commissions signed into law in 2005 as a part of peace agreement, operated in February 2006 to June 2009. The chairperson was Jeremy Verdier, and this chairperson did W, and Omio Kesel appointed treasurer. Purpose: to foster truth, justice, and reconciliations by identifying the root cause of the conflict and determining those who are responsible for community, domestic, and international crimes against the Liberian people. Formal partnerships overseas organizations. TRC cooperated with other organizations locally and around the world, and International Center for Transitional Justice gave theoretical guidelines of TRC producers. Also, TRC learned to give accused persons and victims a chance to be heard, and advocated for human rights, helped to gather testimonies from the diaspora. Diaspora community participated in TRC process. Many refugees in the US took part through the advocacy group.
So there were several unique features of the TRC. The first was in its creation, the legislation gave it very strong power of reporting. So certain recommendations that it would give would be binding on the government. Another unique feature was that out of its $7.5 million budget, close to 60% of that was funded by the government and was supported by President Sirleaf. Another interesting thing that we found was that the commissioners had various backgrounds. So it had, in addition to lawyers, 3 religious leaders, a security specialist, a nurse, and also a journalist. And this Truth Commission not only looked into particular violations of international humanitarian law and human rights violations, but also looked into economic crimes and paid particular attention to gender-specific crimes. It had very limited power for granting amnesty, especially with crimes that had to do with crimes against humanity and international humanitarian law. And also, as we had mentioned, it had formal partnerships with overseas organizations to help collect statements from its citizens that had been displaced and were not currently in the country. So the TRC was very much a standalone operation in the scheme of transitional justice. Besides the TRC, there had been a program implemented under Taylor's dictatorship, which was the Liberian Disarmament, Demobilization, Rehabilitation, and Reintegration. And this program focused on taking particularly child recruited soldiers and fighters and reintegrating them back into society, but it essentially functioned very separately from the TRC. The government was very hesitant to implement anything more than a truth commission because it did not want to create greater tension and conflict. And so a war crimes prosecution court never was set up. There was also a vetting process, but when it came to the high level positions, as we'll discuss a little bit later, it wasn't very effective. So the report, here are a few stats on it, and it's roughly 3 year span. It collected over 20,000 statements and identified more than 93,000 victims. In addition, it found over 163,000 violations, and it was well known for its name and shame component. So it actually named 150 individuals that it recommended to be prosecuted and 49 high-level officials that it recommended being barred for 30 years from being elected into public office. And this actually included President Sirleaf, who was a wide supporter in the beginning and creation of this Truth Commission. So was this a success? This is a difficult question in some ways. So the good things about the Truth Commission in Liberia was that the public, particularly the victims, were largely supportive at the time of its release. It received a lot of publicity, and people felt like because it named and shamed people responsible for the crimes committed, the people were very supportive. But at the same time, it experienced a lot of political controversy because of this name and shame. It investigated abuses not just by one side, but pretty much all groups. And it had a pretty comprehensive report, and we found that the recommendations were actually pretty good, comprehensive recommendations. It also implemented in-camera hearings, which helped to facilitate some protection over witnesses and minors, which was great. But of course, with the political controversy, the government really did not implement any of its recommendations following its release. For example, setting up prosecutions, the individuals that were actually listed, most went unprosecuted. The government never set up a special hybrid tribunal as recommended. And also, the name and shame report had some criticisms of violating due process. Another criticism of the Truth Commission was its lack of probing questions with individuals who were well known to have committed these crimes. And a lot of the questions asked were surface level. And this power that we had discussed earlier, this unique power of binding recommendations that originally was created to have, eventually became unwinded. And for example, the Supreme Court declared that it was unconstitutional for the TRC to recommend banning perpetrators from office, which was interesting. So another thing that's not listed on the slide is that following its release, the widespread population was largely illiterate, and so access to the report was another hurdle for the larger population. And actually, the report got sent overseas to a university in Georgia, so it wasn't taken very seriously by the government in terms of implementation. So depending on the goal of which goal you're looking at for the Truth Commission, in terms of its reporting and exposing certain crimes and naming the individuals responsible, we think it was successful. But in terms of bringing these goals of reconciliation and meaningful change in the scheme of transitional justice, because of the lack of implementation of its recommendations, we don't find it successful. So these are the lessons that we pulled from this particular case. The first thing is that when the individuals named in the report are listed as those responsible for the violations and they are still holding positions of power in the government, recommendations published in that report likely will not be implemented, which is exactly the case here in Liberia. Another thing that we found is that Truth Commissions are effective for exposing and bringing new information to the surface, but particularly in this case, we did not find it was effective for reconciliation in the country. And another thing that we learned is that Truth Commissions are only one step in the transitional justice process. To bring meaningful change and justice for these victims, you can't rely solely on Truth Commissions. There needs to be something to follow in the recommendations. These are our sources. Thank you for listening to our presentation, and we look forward to your questions.